The 2016-17 provincial budget saw operating funding for school divisions cut by $22 million. What is your plan for restoring education funding to previous levels?
I've spent some time reviewing both Dan Perrin's report and the education sector plan. I think firstly, I'm considering revisiting the supports for learning component of the budget, which I see is about 15% of the total. It's the thing that I hear most often in my constituency office and the thing I also hear about most on the campaign trail. I think, however, that will require some discussion about conditionality. Maybe that will be some common ground for us to begin from. Secondly, I note the inclusion of First Nations and Métis children. I think we need to revisit this. It's part of the education sector strategic plan, and it talks about closing the achievement gap for children. I would like to see some look at how we support and include First Nations and Métis children in our current funding model. This also speaks to the recommendations, I believe, 7 and 8 of the TRC recommendations.
Teachers know the importance of inclusive education. This means accommodating students regardless of their physical, emotional, intellectual, or social differences. To be implemented successfully, it requires supports for students and teachers. How will you support inclusive education?
So I've already answered some of this in the previous question, but I do think that we need to revisit the supports for learning funding that along the lines that I suggested in my previous answer. I also would note that I'm not entirely certain that enrollment-based model is the best answer. Currently, you use population health data to determine students' low income, transiency levels, lone parent levels, or refugee status. That might be something that needs to be revisited. I would also add that I fully support the integrative facility model. I've had the opportunity to visit Mama Waititan here in Regina. I think it's a wonderful example of how we include community supports within the school model, which provides, I think, support for both teachers and students, which is very important. Obviously, it has an elders resource center in it. It has the community policing resource center in it. Other communities might require different kinds of supports, but that's the model I think we should be looking at.
One of the most important relationships in education is the relationship between students and their teachers. Teachers know their students, their families, and their communities. How will you ensure local voices are heard?
You know, as a parent, I've always taken my concerns about schooling and the education of my children firstly to the principal, and then sometimes to the home and school community association. I've never contacted my locally elected school board with any of these concerns. However, that said, our government did hear very loud and clear from the community about this issue, and therefore I am committed to upholding locally elected school boards across the province of Saskatchewan. I also, however, support the increased role of the Minister of Education as the final arbiter. I believe this is a balance mixed in the stewardship of both education and taxpayer dollars.
The United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child guarantees access to high-quality public education. What steps will you take to ensure students across our province receive a high-quality education within Saskatchewan's publicly funded public education system?
So firstly, I'm a strong supporter of choice in the school systems and support the government's position on faith-based schools in the wake of the Theodore decision. Secondly, I believe that our students already have access to a very high quality level of education here in Saskatchewan. However, I think there are areas of challenge. One is in the educational outcomes of First Nations children. I've already spoken to that. In response to that issue, I would say again that it's time we revisit the federal provincial funding model to cohesively track outcomes and measure the kinds of interventions that work. Administrative processes that are used to look after INAC tuition fees are probably resources that could be used better in the front line and in the classroom. And finally, I support ongoing curriculum review. I think that's very important. I support the return to common sense math curricula, as well as the inclusion of coding in the curriculum. I know that the labor market is going to have many demands in those areas coming forward.
The Canadian Teachers Federation says safe and caring schools are a major priority for the profession at the national level, yet teachers are expressing growing concern about violence in schools. What is your plan for promoting safe and caring schools in our province?
Well, firstly, I'm proud of the revenge porn legislation that will be introduced as a result of the speech from the throne. That's a very important step in addressing bullying issues in schools, and of course some of those bullying issues have had very tragic consequences. Secondly, I think that violence is a product of exclusion. It's a result of socioeconomic circumstance, and it's also a result of mental health issues. I support the Children's Advocate calls for mental health supports in schools. I think there's a number of ways we can look at that issue. Integrated facilities might be one way. Thirdly, I think if we look at the school shootings across the world, they have something very simple in common, which is that they are largely done by young men. We do need to talk about young men and boys in our school systems, and about healthy views of masculinity and about gender roles more commonly. Man Up Against Violence is a great example of some of that initiative.